Hello and welcome to the Classics Book Club. This is a place to come and delve into all those classics you always wanted to read. Today we'll be chatting about one of the all-time classics, Wives and Daughters by Elizabeth Gaskell. I'd like to firstly welcome Susannah Fullerton as our resident Queen of the Classics.
Hi.
Hi Susannah. She's been president of the Jane Austen Society of Australia for the past 19 years. She's also patron of the Kipling Society of Australia, a founding member of the New South Wales Dickens Society and of the Australian Bronte Association, and a member of the Dylan Thomas Society of Australia. Susannah is Sydney's best-known lecturer on classic novels, and she lectures regularly at the Art Gallery of New South Wales. I'd also like to welcome book club member Sarah Burns, who's president of the Australian Bronte Association. Louise Owens, who is the author of the book lovers blog of choice, readmeblogsite.net.
Hi.
And of course, we'd also like to welcome back all our book club members watching our Hangout on air. And don't forget to pop your questions into the comments and we'll do our best to get to them during the Hangout. And now to the book. Molly Gibson's widower father marries the widow Claire Hyacinth Kirkpatrick. Her world is turned upside down as she has to deal with a frivolous stepmother, as well as a stepsister with whom she has little in common, although they become friends. Cynthia captivates Roger Hamley, the younger son of Squire Hamley, and they become unofficially engaged just before Roger leaves England to do 2 years of scientific research in Africa. Molly harbours a quiet love for Roger. Molly, meanwhile, is warmly received at the home of the Squire Hamley and his disabled wife. Hamley's other son is Osborne, a clever but shallow man who marries unwisely and dies young, much to the disappointment of his father. Cynthia, however, is secretly engaged to Lord Cumnor's land agent, Mr. Preston, who is now terrorising the poor girl to keep her promise of marriage, even though it was obtained under false pretences. And Molly is involved with saving Cynthia's reputation by reclaiming damning letters from Mr. Preston, which ultimately results in Cynthia being freed of her agreement and marrying a respected London lawyer. And Molly and Roger, well, they live happily ever after. Susannah, tell us a little bit more about Wives and Daughters.
Well, Wives and Daughters was sadly Elizabeth Gaskell's last book, and even more sadly, it was an unfinished novel. She died just before writing what was probably the last chapter. So we know how the book is going to finish, but it's really sad that we don't actually have Gaskell's own words for the ending of her novel. The novel is set really in the time of her youth. So she sets it in the 1820s, 1830s, in provincial English society. She depicts a world of gossip, of courtship, of visits, of letter writing. All of those things are very important in the novel. I think it's a lovely book. I'm very, very fond of Wives and Daughters. It's been beautifully filmed by the BBC, and that's well worth watching. And it's also in many ways quite a modern book for the time, in that it depicts a hero who is a scientist. And he is one of the very first scientific heroes in all of literature. So Elizabeth Gaskell is doing something quite new and interesting in choosing such a profession for the hero of her novel. But let's begin by looking at the heroine, Molly Gibson. We first see her as a young child, much loved by her father, but motherless, and at the mercy of others sometimes. And then, of course, we see her in the course of the novel growing up, maturing, learning about herself and about others, and, of course, learning to share her father and to cope with a dreaded stepmother. Elizabeth Gaskell's own father remarried, and she loathed her stepmother. So I think some of her own dislike of what was happening in her own life went into the portrayal of Molly getting a stepmother that she really has no respect for. So how did you all respond to Molly? Did you like Molly Gibson as a heroine, or did you find her too good or not interesting? What were your responses to Molly?
It's interesting that you just said that about Elizabeth Gaskell's mother, because I wondered why Molly was so set against, was just quite seriously concerned about having a stepmother, and I thought that was very strong in the book, and it kind of set a bit of the stage. But I thought she was a really good central person where we could see a whole lot of things evolving around her and how she grew up. I thought she was a very likable character.
What about you, Sarah? Did you like Molly?
Oh, I did. I like Molly, but I think she's a bit too good. She's a bit too. She's a lovely girl, but I don't know why she's had to lie for Cynthia and put her own reputation in jeopardy. But you know, she was a good girl, and she didn't have any other opportunities. Cynthia was so worldly compared to her. She didn't have that experience, but. Yeah, she just is the quiet achiever, and she got her man in the end. So,
Letitia,
I wouldn't say she was, you know, good all the time. I thought she was quite feisty sometimes, and I kind of liked that about her. You know, I think yes, she had that quiet heroine thing going on, but you know, every now and again, like when she confronted Mr. Preston, and you know, really. I think was able for other people to really sort of be quite passionate and forceful. So I didn't like her passive aggressiveness against her stepmother. I thought, like you, Louise, I'm like, what is going on there? But I thought, yes, I still thought she was a heroine that was easy to like. She didn't really do anything too offensive that you wanted to sort of run away from her.
she's a bit overprotected and sheltered, isn't she? Which I think is one of the reasons why she's unable to stand up to Cynthia and say, look, you know, get yourself out of your own mess. I'm not going to ruin my own reputation for you. And her father really tries to overprotect her and says at one stage in the book, you know, teach her to read and write, but don't teach her, you know, keep her a child. If she needs more learning, I'll worry about that later, but I want her to remain a child. And he's really horrified when one of his young medical assistants shows an interest in Molly, and he suddenly starts to realize that his daughter is actually growing up. And he doesn't want that to happen. And when she goes to stay with the Hamleys, they also treat her as a very young girl and expect her to be docile and, you know, serve the breakfast and do the daughterly things around the house. But she has so few opportunities to break out and discover her own character, and you know, she never travels. She doesn't get to the city, whereas Cynthia has experienced so much more. So all the way through the book, we get this wonderful contrast between the two stepsisters, and of course, I think comparing her with Cynthia makes us like Molly more.
Well, it's almost as if Cynthia, by being exposed to that very world that her father, you know, her stepfather is so afraid of, is so corrupt in some ways, and there's the innocent Molly who, you know, isn't subjected to that world, still retains sort of this virtue about her.
Mm. But it's important, I think, when he's looking at her education, he's seen women, and men too, I suppose, just be signing documents with an X, and he's determined his daughter will be able to sign her own name. So he wants her to have some control and some power in that way, but not too much. That's, I think, very important for the times, you know, that was changing, and that she would have some independence by able to write her own name.
And Molly likes to learn, and she's obviously interested in the world of science that Roger represents. I mean, she sees a wasp's nest as a nice present to be given. She is wanting to learn about the world around her. So I think she's quite an unusual Victorian heroine in her interest in the physical world that Elizabeth Gaskell shows in her. What about the Hamley brothers, the two contenders for the possible role of hero? Because for a while, where, you know, Osborne's the one with the good looks, he's the eldest son. Are you convinced from the beginning that Roger's going to be the hero of the novel for Molly?
Yes.
How did you respond to Osborne?
I think he had it all too good. He was the son and the first son and the heir. He was the one who was always going to succeed. He was going to be the one at university. Even though Roger was doing better, it didn't matter. Osborne was the one that counted. Roger was never going to be in contention. So you're rooting for him from the beginning.
I thought it was an interesting device that Gaskell, two of the main players, Osborne and Hyacinth, we kept hearing about them from the beginning, but we weren't introduced to them. They didn't come into the scene with us thinking, when are we going to meet these? There's something strange about that Hyacinth. Why are we not meeting her? Why are we not? Osborne was not revealed until quite a bit later. I thought it was a really interesting device that we were just kind of, this reputation was being built up and built up and built up, and great expectations for these two, which were a little bit slippery characters in the end.
And of course, Osborne turns out to be a character with secrets in a novel that has a lot of secrets in it. He marries a girl who's a French Catholic. And doesn't Elizabeth Gaskell show well the prejudice against people of other religions and other nationalities? It was really quite a xenophobic age, wasn't it? There's no love of foreigners.
But she did it beautifully.
Doesn't she?
And the squire comes round.
The old squire comes round with falling in love with the boy who's going to be the next heir. Is very nicely done.
Yes.
Beautiful.
What about Hyacinth, the wonderfully named Hyacinth? How did you respond to her as a character? Has she any redeeming features?
Well, as Miss Clare, I think at the beginning we're introduced to her, she seems to be all right, but as she goes on and then becomes Mrs. Gibson, no, she's got what she wants.
Well, even at the beginning, just forgetting poor Molly.
Oh, that's not good.
Yeah. It just showed how self-absorbed she was, that, even at the point of just, completing her job, she couldn't sort of see beyond her own needs. So I think from the beginning we were set up to not like her very much.
And I think the teacher says, by comparison to Hyacinth, we feel like we like Molly all the more. She's everything that Hyacinth isn't.
But doesn't Gaskell show well the vulnerability of women? That Hyacinth has had to be a governess. She's having to cope with this daughter that needs to be brought up. She's got uncertain social status. And, of course, when she marries, that changes. And I think what she also shows wonderfully is how little couples often knew each other before they got married. I mean, Jane Austen, of course, shows that with couples like Mr. and Mrs. Bennet. Clearly, they never really got to know each other. And Mr. Gibson, or Dr. Gibson, really doesn't get to know Hyacinth properly. He's got a goal. He wants a stepmother for Molly, and he wants domestic comfort. She's got a goal. She wants financial security, and they really don't know each other at all before getting married. And I think that must have been pretty common, don't you?
Oh, yes.
Well, yeah, marriage was a business almost, and I kind of, in some ways, I respect Hyacinth a little bit for being able to take charge. She didn't just sort of give up and was this sort of victim of her circumstance, I know she wasn't the most likable character, but,
she did what was right for her.
She found a home. She found a home for her child, and and for all her faults, she was a decent person.
And he was a good man. I think she did very well. He's a very good man, Dr. Gibson.
Perhaps not one of his wisest decisions, marrying.
No.
Now, one of the themes of this novel is science, and as I said, choosing a scientific career for a hero was unusual. Now, this book, of course, is written before Darwin's Origin of Species had come out, but Elizabeth Gaskell, writing it in the 1860s, knew about Darwin's book. So she is very aware that a lot of changes are coming in the world of science, and I think that's really reflected in the fact that Roger's got what is seen to be a respectable career, when perhaps 30 years before that it wouldn't have been. Men went to university to learn their Latin and Greek, not to study science. And there's Roger going off on an expedition to Africa, talking science with the local bigwigs. And I think Elizabeth Gaskell's really showing how so much was changing in Victorian society with this interest in science. South mentions the big exhibition at Crystal Palace on the scientific and industrial developments that were taking place. So Gaskell, I think, is very interested in this, and it's a. Can you think of any other books of that era that deal with science in this way?
Well, I was going to say, you don't often even see men having careers. You know, they're often landed gentry or, you know, in the other class. So to find someone of his social standing, even having a career I thought was really interesting in this book.
And being a doctor too. I mean, doctors were starting to come up in status, so she can portray a man like Dr. Gibson as a very respectable, worthy man who can mix socially with people in the neighbourhood. Whereas I think just really, 50 years before, when Jane Austen is creating Mr. Perry in her novel Emma, he's not the social equal of the other people in the village. So in that 50 years, a lot's changed when it comes to the status of doctors.
Well, they've gone from the apothecary to the doctor proper. So it's quite different. The role of doctors and surgeons and apothecaries did change quite dramatically.
This is a novel that has a lot of death in it. And Elizabeth Gaskell was once criticised by Charles Dickens, who said, "I do wish her characters would stay a little bit healthier, that they'd remain more firmly on their own legs and not have as many accidents and deaths." Clearly, Molly has lost her mother. Of course, Hyacinth has lost her first husband, so Cynthia has lost her father. In the course of the novel, Mrs. Hamley dies, Osborne dies. There is a lot of death in this novel. Is that something that might be off-putting to a modern reader, or do we just accept that as part of Victorian society?
Yeah, I think when I think of the Victorian era, I often think of I think of death as just this rather more inevitable happening than we do today. And as you said, it was kind of, science and doctors and hospitals weren't what they were today, so you had a different expectation. In a lot of books that you read, someone gets ill and they're done for, like that.
Yeah. But it's how the people cope with it too, the different ways. They don't just stop. They've got to get on with it. They can't just go to pieces. They've got a lot of things that they need to do, whether it's find a new wife for or mother for their daughter or whatever, but they've got to get on with life. They can't just stop. So it's how they cope.
This is also a novel that I think portrays wonderfully the gossip in English towns, English provincial society. I love some of those scenes where Molly goes off to the various sort of card parties and social evenings that are put on in the town. And the gossip is absolutely rife. And I think it must have been terribly hard to live with that. Everyone knew every detail of your life. And when Mr. Preston comes into the novel and Cynthia is seen with Mr. Preston and, there are notes and all of this gets gossiped about. And yet a reputation can be saved by the local aristocrat showing that she's not listening to the gossip. So don't you think the gossip is a very powerful part of this world that Gaskell's portraying?
And also the home help, who are obviously privy to letters going to and forth and what they must know, and there's lots of small innuendos and looks and understandings. There wasn't much privacy, it seems.
Servants must know everything.
And if you think the note that is stopped from going to Molly right in the beginning from one of those medical students, it's the servant who gets penalised. She loses her job for being the go-between, and that doesn't seem fair. So there is some double standards or different rules for the different classes.
This, of course, is an unfinished novel. How does that affect the way we respond to it? Does that put you off reading it in the first place because it's never been finished?
It's so close to being finished. Like, it doesn't feel like a novel that, like, it could have ended there. It didn't feel like there was like massive unresolved storylines, or that sort of unknown, like what did she want to happen? You sort of really felt that where it ended is where it should have been. That's how
And the fact that she gave an indication as to where it was going, so we do know that it's not like Sanditon, which for Jane Austen, it was only just getting started. This was a complete novel. It just hadn't been finished.
Yeah. And, of course, when it was turned into the film version, it did give the filmmakers great scope. They could do whatever they liked in that last chapter, so long as they brought Molly and Roger together. And I think they did it really nicely. I like the way
it's wonderful.
it was beautifully done. In fact, they even show Molly wearing trousers in Africa. She's walking on some plateau and she's wearing almost like sort of jodhpurs or riding pants, which would have been very unusual for a woman then, but clearly she's embraced modernity.
Well, I definitely think we can all agree that finished or not finished, this was definitely a great novel by Elizabeth Gaskell, and certainly less controversial than our last book club, ladies.
It is a very easy novel to read, isn't it? I personally find Gaskell's style very light, entertaining, very, very easy to read. Much easier, say, than the style of George Eliot, which, of course, we were discussing recently with The Mill on the Floss. Her style is unfussy and flows easily, and she does wonderful descriptions. It is an easy novel to read. Did you all find that?
Absolutely.
That's right.
She's a very beautiful writer.
She is. She's wonderful.
I think we can definitely
I just wish she had lived another few weeks and written that last chapter. It's really sad. She literally died mid-sentence. She was sitting in a room, chatting to her daughters, having a cup of tea, started to say something, and her heart stopped, and she died mid-sentence. So maybe it's quite appropriate that she also died without completing her novel, since she never lived to finish her sentence either.
Wow. Well, sadly for us, she didn't finish the novel, but luckily for us, she got right to the very inch of finishing it. So I think we can all agree we definitely enjoyed this one. But I'm really excited to talk about our next book club book, which, Susannah, don't jump out of your seat, is Emma by Jane Austen, which we shall be enjoying on the 25th of August. So I really look forward to seeing all our book club members then, and I want to give a big thank you to Louise, Sarah and Susannah for joining us for book club tonight.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.